Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6, we'll be reading verses 1 through 8. It says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say unto you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly, I say unto you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him." And then we got two bonus verses, verse 16, so slide down there. "And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say unto you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head, wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you."
Thanks, Bill. And this extension of the Sermon on the Mount is where we are, of course, going again this morning. As we finished off chapter 5, we went through the Beatitudes and some of the teaching of righteousness that Jesus gave to his disciples, and he instructed his new kingdom community on what they should value. That was a bit of a gist of what was happening there. The things they should value, where their hearts should be at, and how were they going to practically live that way? If they said that they were his disciples, well then what should a disciple's life look like? And that is what we were looking at in chapter 5. Jesus was instructing and training his would-be disciples on how they were called to live as kingdom citizens, and how to properly understand the law that was given, these commands. How should they understand them, interpret them, and live them out? How were they going to have different values from the world that was around them? And they should love in a new way. There was a new way of loving that Jesus was calling them to. And so Jesus has just given us a whole lot of practical ways to do this. And now we look at chapter 6, where he starts by giving us a warning in how we walk this stuff out. Here's some practical examples, Jesus said, of how to live. But now here's some warnings on how you need to walk these things out. In the midst of this warning, what we didn't read is his teaching on how to pray. That's what we know as the Lord's Prayer, his teaching on prayer, and we're going to skip over that, and we're going to look at that next time. But for today, we just want to look at these warnings which we heard read just a few moments ago, because there are ways in which we can do the things that Jesus is instructing us to do in what he would refer to as hypocritical ways. And so we want to be careful of that. And so let's start by looking at a few key words that we find in these verses, because as we read these three sections, they're very similar. They kind of follow the same format, and Jesus reiterates the words that he is using three different times. The first word, the way in which he starts this whole thing out, he says, beware. That's the beginning of chapter 6. First of all is this warning, beware. And that means that there's a right way and that there's a wrong way to listen and do all the things that Jesus has taught us. There could be kind of a trap in it, and it's a trap that we fall easily into because of our sinful nature. So beware how we do all that he has instructed us to do in chapter 5. There's a warning in it. He follows that up with talking about practicing righteousness. He says, beware when practicing your righteousness. This means that our righteousness must be something more than what we believe in or something that we trust in. It's got to be something that we practice. Beware when you are practicing your righteousness. It's a little bit like the quote that we read last week from C.S. Lewis from Mere Christianity, where he encourages us not to get too stuck in trying to determine whether or not you actually love your neighbor, but rather, he said, just start acting as though you do. And as you act, you will find that you really start personally changing. Begin to act these things out. Practice your righteousness. Don't just talk about it, but this is something that we must act on. And so Jesus says there is a practicing and a physical component to righteousness, but it comes with a caution. And he gives us 3 examples of where we can find ourselves getting tripped up in these verses. One is in our serving, one is in our praying, and the other is in our fasting. Those are the 3 things we're going to look at. Now, the other word that he talks about, what I'd say is a key word, is rewards. And in all 3 of these sections, 3 times he mentions rewards. This is a bit of the theme here. What he says is that it's possible to do these things for the accolades of people rather than out of a heart transformation. And if we do them for the accolades of people, then that will be the end of that reward. God will not reward us for acts of righteousness that are done for the approval of people. So this chapter is a very searching chapter, when we read it. Why do we do any of the things that we do? In fact, it can be a very painful one to read, as Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones points out. He describes it as one of the most uncomfortable chapters in the whole Bible to read, because it takes a look at our whole life, all of our actions, all of our deeds, all of our words, and it holds them up to a mirror. It says, why are you doing the things that you do? And I'm so thankful for it, because it's good for us to have this. It's good to consider why we do what we do. We should be ready to know who we are and to have the word search our hearts. Most secular people think they know themselves, but how do they know? What are the standards by which the world judges themselves by? Because I think it's very easy for us to fool ourselves. We see things we're doing, we're saying, I'm doing pretty good, I'm doing the right thing, look at all of these things that I'm doing, and sometimes we can avoid self-examination at all costs. Because we want to understand, where's our heart at? Yeah, maybe I'm doing all of these things, but where is my heart in the midst of it? And Jesus wants to hit us right where the heart is. And so here's this mirror that gets held up to us that says, why do we do what we do? Why do we say what we say? And why is this difficult? Because it's painful. It can be painful to take an honest look. In this chapter, it brings us face to face with ourselves, and it helps us to see ourselves exactly as we are. And this was a bit of the gist of what Dwight was even talking about this morning in his testimony, of how easy it is for us to just go through life, to be teaching, to be reading, to be studying, to be serving, and to doing all these things, but yet forsaking our heart and where our heart is at in the midst of it. But let's be thankful for this. Because at the end of our lives, and we don't know when that will be, none of us do we want to come to the knowledge that all of our rewards, everything that we have been working towards, all those rewards, they've already been given to us. That there's nothing that will remain. It's all done, and there's nothing left for us. Or, upon our earthly demise, do we want to have the knowledge that all of our rewards are about to be revealed, and that they will last for all eternity? What a glorious thought that is. Jesus hits that head on in this chapter. And that brings up this huge topic of rewards. We want to look at that today as well. What are the rewards that God's talking about here, and is it wrong to desire these rewards? That's something that we might struggle with as well. Are they a motivator for you? Are you motivated by rewards? Now, this word reward, it runs right through these 18 verses, and I would say it's a word that we can allow ourselves to sometimes feel guilty about. And Jesus tells us that our rewards are either going to come from people or they're going to come from God. Those are the 2 sources of the rewards that we will receive. And I say that we can feel guilty about rewards because there have been themes and streams in philosophical thought, even in Christian thought, that have said that we should never do anything with the motivation of receiving a reward. Have you ever felt that kind of consternation within you when you're doing something? Is this for a reward? Is it okay if I would do this in order to receive a reward? The German philosopher Immanuel Kant was a proponent of the notion that the moral value of an act decreases as we aim to derive any benefit from it. Acts are good if the doer is disinterested. We do the good only because it is good. Any motivation to seek joy or rewards corrupts the act. Now, if you're in first-year university philosophy, you have most likely debated this. But fortunately, there have been great and influential theologians, It's like Jonathan Edwards, C.S. Lewis, Martin Lloyd-Jones, most recently John Piper, who have argued against this type of a philosophy, that rewards are a God-given delight, and that they should actually be pursued. Really seems to be what Jesus is talking about in this passage, and others. Because Jesus says that if we practice our righteousness in order to be seen, you'll have no reward in heaven. And he says if our actions are for others and we get their praise, we have received all the reward that we will get. And he also says that if our works are done in secret, then God who sees in secret will reward you. Now, one of the reasons why Jesus says this is that when we do good deeds in order to be seen, I think we find that we're actually doing them for ourselves. When we do deeds for others to see and to notice, it's filling something within us that we want to have filled. We're kind of doing it for ourselves more so. We want others to notice so that we will feel good about what we've done. We've earned ourselves a little bit of God's favor, or maybe our own favor. We've really done the thing for us and not really for the other person at all. Now it's interesting, I think we use rewards all the time. We teach our children from a very young age to obey us by the use of rewards. Some would say that the sticker chart was the greatest invention of the 20th century. You know, little Tommy goes to the bathroom all by himself and we say, good for you, Tommy, and now you get a gold star. Or maybe it's a few raisins or some chocolate chips. And so it begins. Well, Tommy likes getting gold stars and seeing how they accumulate on his sticker chart. And he certainly likes getting a little box of raisins between meals. At least I did, if I can remember back that far. I don't know if all kids like raisins, but whatever it was for you. Well, little Tommy gets a little bit older, becomes a teenager, and now their rewards change. Now if Tommy keeps his room clean, he gets to use the family car on Tuesday night to go to youth group. Then eventually Tommy gets a job and finds himself working for bonuses and maybe the praise of his fellow employees or bosses. Well, finally he gets married and he finds that if he completes all the tasks on his honey-do list, he might get a special dessert that night. Or something, whatever it might be. The rewards are all around us. Our society is really operating on a more complex reward system than the sticker chart that we started off with. And is this wrong? Is there anything the matter with working for rewards? Well, as I mentioned, there have been those who have said that it is wrong, that if we are working for a reward, that our effort is not truly altruistic. But is that true? Then why does Jesus and later on Paul talk about these rewards so often in their writings? I mean, look at the life of Jesus himself. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, it tells us that we are to look to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, that joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. See, the cross of Christ represents the greatest suffering in history. For Jesus not only suffered physically, but also experienced extreme elements of shame and of God's wrath in taking upon himself the sins of the world. But still, the promise of future reward and joy gave Jesus the strength to suffer. It was ever before him. And his rewards were really our rewards. We're the one who ultimately benefit. But yet this is what he has done. So let's take a minute to look at these three areas that Jesus is talking about in these verses. And the first area that we heard mentioned in verses 2 to 4 is what we might call serving to be noticed. And it says this, "Thus when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. For truly I say to you that they have already received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not even let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." So Jesus confronts those who would serve the poor and give the poor in order to be seen by others. You know, they make a loud presentation of it. Trumpets are blown. They're making sure everybody can see the good works that they have done. Everybody knows. Whether it was the trumpet or whether it was a photo op, you know, someone was there to see and it was getting noticed. And, you know, we can think about this in our context. We might think it's easy to throw politicians under the bus for this one because it's so obvious. You know, get out in the community, do some good, make sure your PR person is along with you so that you can post it to social media and maybe get into a few publications. Were you really there to help, or were you there to promote a campaign? But any of us can fall prey to this, because it looks pretty good when we serve people. It's nice to be noticed, but who is it really for? Maybe it's a combination of the two of these things, right? It can be a bit of a win-win. The people get served, and I get to look good while doing it. Well, who really gets hurt by that? Well, certainly the people who are being served, they get the benefit, and that's good. We should be happy when people do this. But we who are doing it shouldn't think that there will be some future reward for us with that kind of an attitude or motivation. What we have received is what we will get. No more future reward that is given. And in the midst of it, we might find that there's something happening in our heart as well when that becomes our primary motivation, something that isn't good. But if you're not doing it in order to be seen, but are doing it because God has called us to do it, and He is pleased with us when we obey Him, and we genuinely have a love for people, He will reward us. Jesus says, don't even let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Like our giving and our serving should be so discreet that even your left hand should not know what your right hand was doing. Like your right hand was the one that's doing the serving. Typically, this is the one where the action happens. And He says, even to the extent where this hand that is idle doesn't even know what is happening. Like if you're taking selfies with yourself and the recipients at Food Bank and posting it on social media with the hashtag I love serving people, you may need to do a bit of a heart check. But when you do these things quietly, not announcing it, we're told that God sees. God knows. These things do not go unnoticed because He sees secret things. And so 3 times we are told God sees the things that are done in secret, and how much better is that reward that we will receive from Him. Thinking of all of the giving and the serving that you are currently doing, what is your motivation in it? Why do you do the serving that you do, the giving that you do, the helping that you do? Is there even a hint of self-adulation in it? I think maybe you should make a distinction between adulation and gratification. Because adulation is wanting to be noticed and wanting to be admired. That's what's being talked about here. But then there's a gratification. Gratification is joy. And I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with that. Having gratification out of the serving that we do. I don't think we're saying, or that Jesus is saying that when we serve, we got to be like, kind of down in the mouth and just kind of like, really kind of down about it and like trying to keep our head down, because there is a gratification that comes in it that's a good thing that brings joy to us. And that's a God-given joy. Because it actually does feel good to serve people. And what we find is that when we're serving with this attitude, that there's a joy that comes with it, that gratification that's a good thing from God. You'll receive that benefit of feeling a good thing for the work that you have done, and that's a God-given thing that He's given us. So I don't think that Jesus is warning about that here. It's the adulation and the admiration of others, that we are doing something really special that other people aren't doing, and we want them to notice. That's what we don't want to have characterize our serving. Jesus says there'll be no further reward if that is the case. Now the next topic that he brings up is the praying to be noticed. In verses 5 to 6, he says, when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you that they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room, shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So Jesus next confronts the person who loves to pray loud, passionately, with many words. And they do this because they like for people to know how spiritual they are. And Jesus calls these people hypocrites. Now this is one that I know I need to take to heart. And I need to hold the mirror up to myself in this. I often obviously pray publicly, praying in small groups, and I think, what characterizes my prayers? Why am I praying what I'm praying? What is at the heart of what I'm even praying? I'm obviously pretty used to praying in public. It kind of comes with the territory. And so I need to pay close attention to my heart and to my intentions. Am I doing it to show how many great words I can use? Or how much I care about the issue? Or how I'm thinking about things in a unique way that no one else is, that I'll be admired by? Do I pile on the emotions so that it looks like I'm more compassionate than I really am, as a way to manipulate other people's emotional responses? These are things to watch out for that could happen in my heart, and I think have happened over the course of time, and things that we need to take care of. But I also realize that for other people, public praying, that's like the worst thing you can ask somebody to do. It's worse than just being asked to speak in public, to pray in public, right? And I know it's a great fear of a great many people. I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up this morning if you find this daunting, but it doesn't need to be narrowed down, I think, even just to only praying of what Jesus is getting at here. I think it could be speaking at a church meeting, making a comment that could impress others because of how pious it is, or just in the way we present our spirituality even. Do we present ourselves as being more spiritual than we really are? Have you ever found yourself guilty of that? Maybe being more heartfelt or more pious or more righteous. See, that's what Jesus is referring to here in this illustration. They did it through their prayers. They looked very spiritual, very heartfelt, very pious by their many words. And so I think that this can even go beyond just specific praying. So whether it's in praying, in teaching, in preaching, or even conversations that you might have with others, are we doing it to be noticed? To present ourselves as something different than what we really are? If so, you have already received your reward for it. No more will be given, Jesus says. Now, how do we know that if this might be us, if this might be something we could be guilty of? I think one way is to take a look at our private prayers. Are your public prayers radically different than your private prayers? Are you looking for different ways to pray, using different words and expressions? It's not going to be exactly the same, but our public prayer life should really come out of and be an extension of our private prayer life. Do you have one of those? Do you have a robust private prayer life? Because that is the essential component, and then it will inform our public prayer life as well. Jesus says that we should have this. Do you present yourself as being more spiritual or more righteous or among your Christian brothers and sisters than you do in your home or in your workplace or in your school that you want people to notice? Is there a different spirituality that you have here than you have in other places? This is something to check our hearts about. Because here Jesus says, he says, when you pray. He says, when you pray, go into your private space and pray. And your heavenly Father who sees in secret will reward you. That's actually kind of amazing when you think about that even faithful praying will be rewarded by God. That's an incredible promise. Jesus promises us this, that faithful praying is something that will be rewarded by him. Now, the third area that Jesus brings up as an illustration is fasting, to be noticed in verses 16 to 18. That said this, when you fast, don't look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces that their fasting could be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they've received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head, wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So here's the last group that Jesus confronts, are those who would make it obvious that they're fasting. They contort their faces. They make it look as though they are really suffering. They're really going through a hard time. I haven't eaten in days. I'm going through this time of suffering because of a very religious reason. I'm a very religious person. Now, each of these categories we've kind of generalized, right? The one on serving the poor, we sort of generalized to serving in general. The one on prayer, we generalized to how we present our spirituality, whether in church. And this one on fasting, I think we could generalize to be about any of the suffering that we are going through, and particularly for religious reasons. When we're going through times of sufferings, what do we do about it? Do we want others to really notice? When we're fasting or when we're going through a difficult time of suffering, particularly for a religious reason, are we looking for attention in our suffering? I think many of us do enjoy a little bit of attention for our suffering at times. I know as a kid, I was really guilty of this. I used to love getting an injury that was really visible. I'd always hoped for like a good scar on my face. I thought that would be really cool. As a city kid, lots of my relatives were farmers, and I remember going to one of their farms, and of course they had a farm dog, some kind of a mongrel guard dog kind of thing, and I went up to it and I blew on its face to see what it would do. I was curious about these kind of things as a child. And sure enough, after the third time doing that, it raised its head up and it bit me in the head. I thought that was great. Now I'd have like a good scar that people would really notice. I still do to this day. I wish I didn't have it anymore, but at that time I did. But eventually I got over that attitude of like thinking that it would be great to be noticed for the suffering that we've gone through. But sometimes we don't get over this. Lots of people do this really. You know, they wear their suffering on their sleeve in order to get noticed. And it can kind of be a fine line between being honest and how we're really doing, which is important. You know, when we're going through a difficult time and we're part of a family together, we want to be real and genuine with one another. But sometimes we can sort of exaggerate the point in order to look for attention or to make it seem like we are really more spiritual than what we are. Sometimes we even do this in our evangelism, in our sharing of our faith. Like I knew this guy who always claimed to being persecuted for his faith because of how his evangelism was always rejected. But as I understood more and more what he was doing and how he was doing it, it wasn't persecution as much as he had a unique way of turning people off. Being brash or abrasive or overly confrontational and then claiming that you're being persecuted. I think we can maybe have a tendency of doing these kind of things. Is that really the persecution that Jesus is talking about here? Is this real persecution? You know, Jesus says that we can be guilty of this in order to look more spiritual than we are. And this is what was happening. Look at how I'm fasting. Look at how distressed I am in my religious observance. We want people to see how we are suffering in our fasting or our other Christian work. And Jesus says if that is our attitude, no eternal rewards for that. It's also interesting that Jesus assumes that his disciples will fast. Just as he talked about prayer, he says with fasting, he says when you are fasting. It's something that he would expect and was assuming that his people were doing. But we don't do it for others to notice. It's something that is between you and God, and he sees what you are doing. Okay, so those are the three examples that Jesus gives. Do you practice any of those things in order to be seen by others? And I would say that Jesus is giving three examples here, but it's not exhaustive. Because as we noticed right at the beginning at verse 1, he says, when you're practicing your righteousness before other people, it's all kinds of things. These are three specific examples, but it could be in any area. Do we practice any of these things in order to be seen by others? What's the motivation that we have in our good works? So as we kind of look at this as a whole, just a couple of things that I would mention as we come near to the end. Some concluding principles is I think one thing is that we need to realize that we are always in the presence of God. There's nowhere that we can be or go where we are not in his presence. And as disciples, we need to realize that. Notice how in all three of these illustrations that Jesus gives, he uses that same phrase all three times, your Father who sees in secret. He sees our every action. He knows our every thought. We are always in his sight. He knows our hearts, and others do not. That we can deceive people and convince them that we are quite selfless, but God knows our heart. I think it's not a bad thing to wake up in the morning and to say to ourselves that in everything that I do, in everything that I attempt, in everything that I think and even imagine, it's going to be done in the presence of God. Do we have that attitude? That all that we are doing, all that we are going to do in this day that is before me will be done in the presence of God. He is going to be with me. You know, I was thinking about this. I was thinking about that well-known chapter in Psalm 139 that really confirms this. I just want to read some of these verses to reiterate this truth and to encourage us with this. In Psalm 139, he says, O Lord, you've searched me and you know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, and you are acquainted with all of my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in, behind me and before me, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful to me. It is high, and I cannot attain it. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness, it's not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is a light with you. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as there was yet none of them. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. What a beautiful psalm that just talks to our experience so specifically. The Lord knows. The Lord sees. He has knit you together. He knows you intimately. The darkness is not dark to him. There's nowhere where we can go where we can escape his comfort and his care, his vision over us. We need to take that to heart. We rise up in our day and we recognize that there is nothing that I will do in this day that will not be done in the presence of God. The second concluding principle is that we are called to live a publicly Christian life. That is very clear in what Jesus is teaching here. You see, Jesus has talked about God seeing in secret and us doing some of these things in secret, but he is also saying, when you are practicing your righteousness before people, when you are practicing it before people. See, Jesus' words here are also when you give. He doesn't say if you give, when you pray, when you fast, when you practice your righteousness. This is a non-negotiable for the disciple of Christ. We are to be constantly living out the relationship that we have with Jesus in public. If we are truly in love with God, practicing our righteousness before other people and giving to the needy, that's not going to be a question. We will just do it. You see, the motivating factor here is love for God. The pure service of a disciple is motivated by love. You don't need to keep an account. God does that. He sees everything and he records it all. If we forget about it and do everything to please him, we will find that God has the account. Nothing that we have done will ever be forgotten. Our smallest acts will be remembered. We may not be rewarded openly in this world, but on the great day when all the secrets are disclosed, Jesus will say, "Well done, my good and faithful servant, and now enter into the joy of the Lord." And if we have practiced our right living, not in order to be seen, but out of love, there will be a multitude of rewards for you. Rewards that will last for all eternity. And oh, how worth it that will be. Let's pray. Well, Father God, we thank you for this heart check this morning. God, we thank you for this call that you have given us, that we are called to live out our righteousness before others. And so I pray, God, that we would do this faithfully. And just as you have said, that we would not do it in order to be seen by others, but to be seen by you and you alone, God. May this be our motivating factor, that we would be so overwhelmed by the love of God in our own life, that it would flow out into the lives of those who are around us, God. That our motivating factor would be the gospel of Jesus Christ and how you have saved us, how you have done for us what we could not have done for ourselves, that we were hopeless until we found our hope in you. This is the ultimate message that needs to shape our hearts, Father. And as our hearts are shaped by this message, I pray, God, that we would act out accordingly, out of a motivation for that love. So I thank you that you have given this to us, and may we be faithful in the way in which we act this out day by day. In Christ's name, amen.